So I'll now turn it over to the panel on our first takeaway, which is on robust support for justice and accountability, with a specific focus on Ethiopia and Ukraine. And so we'll hear from primary investigators Fong Pham and Patrick Vinck.
Thank you so much, Pablo and David, and thank you, Jeff. That was really a fantastic introduction. So as Jeff said, we'll focus now on the first takeaway, which is focusing on support for justice and accountability, zooming in on the data and analysis we've done so far for Ethiopia and Ukraine. Patrick Vinck and Tadesse Metekia is going to lead us in that presentations. And then after the presentations, we'll hear a response from Ambassador Beth Van Schaack, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. Then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. And at that time, please, if you have a questions, raise your hand and we'll bring you in as a panelist. So with that, I'll hand this over to Patrick and Tadesse.
Good morning, everyone. I have the pleasure to get us started with the, I guess, the more substantive part of the training and the discussion of some of the findings and results to date. And I realize there's kind of a weird shadow, but that's okay. I'll try to move on the side. I suppose, as was mentioned, this first takeaway and first panel is really dedicated to the perspective of the population. And I suppose the good news is that across the surveys, past surveys that we have reviewed, there's also new surveys that we have conducted, we can see a continued strong, robust demand for justice and accountability. And this is important because, as we will see some of the later finding, the provision of justice has not necessarily kept up to pace with that demand. And we see that there is, again, a lot of unmet needs and demands for accountability. However, there is a but, which is that this demand is not uniform, and you have divides, you have diverging views on accountability within a given population. And so what I'll present very briefly, I cannot do justice to such complex situation as Ethiopia and Ukraine in a few minutes, but let me just highlight some results on that, some very rapid results that showcase this kind of issue of diverse views and what it means. Let me first start with Ethiopia, with the additional support from the Global Initiative for Justice and Truth and Reconciliation, to TJET, which of course we're very grateful to Global Affairs Canada for the overall support to the project. With their support, we collected new data, a very large survey, more than 6,000 participants nationwide in Ethiopia. But to highlight this issue of disagreement on what needs to be done, you can see on this map, for example, response to the question as to where or what venue people would favor for trial. And what you see is that in Tigray, it is largely support for an international tribunal, whereas in the rest of the country, it's either much more divided or much more in support of domestic courts. This is not surprising to anyone who has been paying attention to the dialogue and discussion in Ethiopia, but it's really in almost very stark contrast highlights how you can, the challenges of navigating these competing demands at time for mechanism and what it means for their effectiveness. A second example of this also in Ethiopia is the temporality. What period should be prioritized? Now, most people recognize the importance of prioritizing the more recent onset of violence since 2018. But again, it is not universally true. And we see that there are regions like Somali region, for example, where a majority of the population wants to see violence between 1991 and 2018 being prioritized. And you can see from the results that there is a lot of demands for earlier periods in general as well. So again, this can create a source of tension if some forms of violence are prioritized, either because of political will or simply for resources. It's expensive to be all-encompassing, and so there are challenges in meeting those demands. But the point and what these surveys highlight is the existing tension, and we'll go to the implication in a minute. With the Center on National Security at Georgetown Law, we were able to do another survey as part of the project in Ukraine. And here, highlighting this diverging view is the issue of collaborators. Now, you can see that when it comes to what sentence, what kind of punishment people want to see happen for Russians responsible for serious crimes, there is a large, majority and support for strong punishment. But when it comes to collaborators, it's much more divided. And I would say even more significantly is the fact that there is no strong agreement on what does it mean to be a collaborator. And if you were simply a teacher who stayed behind, are you a collaborator? If you were a policeman who stayed behind, if you're a fireman, like what does it mean to be a collaborator is not universally agreed. And here it matters because we see in this population strong support for popular justice. I don't want to call it mob justice, but people taking justice in their own hands if they don't see the process as meeting their demands. So there's really an actual risk of violence if the demand is not being met. Now, I don't have a whole lot of time to elaborate, but what we are advocating and what we think these data show is the importance not of arguing of peace versus justice, but really to take a conflict prevention lens when designing transitional justice and thinking through this idea of doing no harm and really preventing and making sure that we are not furthering any kind of violence or re-traumatizing people or creating dynamics that may not or that may ultimately result in renewed forms of violence. Further analysis of the survey also highlight the importance of trauma-informed transitional justice. I know we've mentioned victim-centered transitional justice, which has been a big part of our career. Evidence-based transitional justice is this idea of not just randomized controlled trial, but really the kind of results that we are showing here, understanding the context in which it's happened so that we can design transitional justice in a more effective manner. But to these two propositions, we add and propose the importance of trauma-informed transitional justice. What we find is that trauma, mental health, really drives demand for trials and prosecution, and that people are more willing to take risk, even if there are issues of punishment, like it's almost a revenge model. I hesitate to use the word, but it makes sense. But we see the importance and the impact of trauma in a range of attitudes, behavior, and perception around transitional justice. And so the work of colleagues on a newly created initiative on Arc for Justice and trauma is really important in that sense. Finally, is the importance of trust in the process. This is, again, something we've emphasized for a long time, but we now have strong data showing how, for example, reparations increase civic participation and perceived state legitimacy when the process is seen as impartial, when the process is seen as effective. And we see the same dynamics happening when it comes to trials. In both Ukraine and Ethiopia, there is a strong deficit of trust in these processes, which means that the ability of those mechanisms to achieve any kind of objective at the population level is greatly diminished because of the lack of trust. In terms of next steps, what we are really continuing now working on this data is first to unpack a little bit those kind of tensions and dynamics around local versus international approaches, local norms versus global initiatives. We're trying to unpack the drivers of needs and demands for accountability and justice and what shapes people's opinion. And we're really interested in furthering analysis of intergenerational effects, both from studies in Cambodia to South Africa. We know that how younger generation perceive mechanism may greatly differ from those who were directly affected and central to the development of mechanisms like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Finally, because of the centrality of trust, we are really looking at what are those attributes of transitional justice that demonstrate quality, that build trust, and that make them more effective. But to continue the conversation, I'll hand over to my colleague Tadesse, who can delve more into details of the Ethiopia context. Tadesse, over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Yes. I hope you can see this. For the next 5 minutes, I wanted to focus on the most important or more controversial aspect of the transitional justice process in Ethiopia, which is the criminal accountability aspect, in particular, the venue for proposed trials. So from the initial idea from hybrid courts to what we have in the policy now as a special bench. So essentially, in terms of subject matter jurisdiction for criminal accountability, the policy focuses on civil and political rights violations, and the process is expected to go as far back as 1995 for criminal prosecutions. Then the truth-seeking, reparation, amnesty mechanisms are not time-bound. The policy also plans to utilize traditional justice mechanisms in truth-seeking, reparation, and amnesty efforts. And so, regarding what we have in the policy that was adopted in April 2024 by Council of Ministers, is a special bench in Ethiopian courts to deal with international crimes. The proposal or the recommendation by the working group of experts as was also included in the national consultations report of December 2023 was to establish a special court with international experts as co-judges and as co-prosecutors, which essentially means a hybrid court that applies also international law. But the decision by the Council of Ministers didn't take this forward, though the ministers decided to opt for a special bench instead of a special court. But if we go back further and look at this issue of the judicial mechanism that was initially proposed in the green paper drafted by the Transitional Justice Working Group of Experts in January 2023, the group considered hybrid or international mechanism as neither desirable nor feasible. So it looks like the decision is not more from hybrid to special, but from the initial suggestion for a special or domestic court to special bench in Ethiopia's domestic process. And so be that as it may, if we look at the HHI survey, Patrick has also mentioned the low level of trust in the judicial system. It overall stands at 26%, but this doesn't really mean Ethiopians have preferred international mechanism over domestic institutions. The response showed that more of criminal accountability through domestic mechanisms, as you can see from the chart here. And what I would also need to highlight from the policy when it refers to the special bench, this is more of like special bench extraordinary. This special bench, the one that's being proposed in the policy, is different from what we know as a special bench in Ethiopia, which is traditionally a separate courtroom with judges assigned to deal with the specific cases. But this one is kind of a unique special bench with its own admin, with its own registrar, with public defenders unit, with victims participation unit, with experts advisory and technical support, and also the structure is quite complex. We are going to have optionally special benches at the regional level, at federal level, and with appeals and cassation benches. within the Federal Supreme Court. This is more of a special bench by name, but special court by design, in my opinion. The problem I see here is the special bench that is being proposed is more sophisticated than what we have in the court system. So the host system may not be able to carry this more complex and sophisticated special bench. For instance, victims participation unit is very new. We don't have it in our legal system, in the judicial system in Ethiopia. The issues of incompatibility, manageability would arise unless this is carefully implemented. Thank you so much. I will be here for Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Tadesse and Patrick. That was an excellent presentations. I'd like to invite Ambassador Beth Van Schaack, who is the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice at the U.S. State Departments, to provide some response to these presentations. And, beyond her diplomatic role, she's also a legal and academic scholar. I don't know how she does it, and has published extensively on transitional justice. So, Ambassador, please take 10 minutes to respond.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, and welcome. Good morning. It's really great to be here. I've seen some of the results of this research over the last couple of, actually even years at this point, and I've been following all of your scholarship as an academic and now as a practitioner and a diplomat. So it's just really incredible to see all of this coming together. I thought I would talk a little bit before delving into some of the specifics about how we use this work as policymakers and diplomats, because it's incredibly important. We don't have the ability to do this kind of empirical, comparative, longitudinal work in-house. We have a few centers within government that do sort of these long-term research projects, but they tend to be very small and very much motivated by particular crises moments. We don't have the luxury of stepping back and thinking long-term. The Atrocity Prevention Board, now Atrocity Prevention Task Force, helped improve that. I mean, we really were able to think creatively about the imperative of prevention and what tools existed, and we were able to rework some of the mechanisms of government in order to be better able to do prevention, and relying upon a survey through our intelligence community, but also our academic partners of risk factors, et cetera. And you guys are now doing that in the transitional justice space. So for that, it's incredibly important. I've worked in this area for many years, both in government and out of government. And I can say that in government, there's often a really strong impulse to draw a thick black line after conflict or repression and just try and put it under the rug and really focus on the future. There isn't, there's a concern that lingering on the past and raising issues of justice and accountability and even truth-telling risks backsliding into conflict. And so the kind of research that you all have done, Catherine and others, Fong, Jeff, and now Tadesse, it's so great to have you as part of this community, really shows that that is not a viable way forward. It may create some very short-term gains in terms of stability and calmness, but in the end, these grievances reemerge, and survivors have very real and very strongly felt expectations and preferences around a justice response. They have expectations that there will be some response to the commission of atrocities or deep-seated repression. And we need to be responsive to those expectations and preferences. And so the fact that you have really perfected the idea of a population-based survey coupled with sort of mixed methodologies is incredible to give insights into what those expectations are. And the fact that you're doing this at a new level of granularity is also really important, because it's one thing to say justice, but as you show with your disaggregated data, justice can mean many different things to many different people. A new survey was just put out of Rohingya refugees, and for them, justice means citizenship and full civil and political rights, equal membership in the polity of a new Burma or Myanmar post-transition. They also care about holding those responsible for atrocities, but one of the real preferences and how they conceptualize justice is that idea of equal rights within their community. So these surveys are incredibly important so that we really have an understanding of what people envision for the future in the event that there is a genuine transition and the society can start thinking about how to address crimes or repression of the past. It's really also, in many respects, a proof of concept of the idea of transitional justice. We have the luxury now of having these huge data sets that you all, with your graduate students, have built. So thank you for that, that allow us to do now this comparative work, this data analytical work, statistical work to show that societies that invest in some measure of transitional justice, to include truth-telling process, but also some measure of accountability, trials of those most responsible, emblematic cases, those societies do better across a whole range of democratic indicators. That conclusion really helps me in government, because if I'm faced with this impulse to say, no, 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 we can't look back, we've got to focus on the future, we can't risk backsliding into conflict or repression, I can say, actually, transitional justice helps to instantiate peace. It helps to instantiate a democratic transition. It helps to respond to those felt needs for justice so that you don't have a self-help or a vengeance situation, as Patrick was talking about. And so being able to convince policymakers that investing in transitional justice ultimately works in the long term to try and bring about the kind of society that we all as an international community want to see as part of the community of nations. And so being able to look at those big aggregated studies that Jeff does and Catherine does are incredibly important, while at the same time coupling that with the very focused and deep research, thick description, thick analysis that is able to be generated by these surveys, so that when we're working in particular societies, we're not taking a kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, but rather we can really think about what the expectations are. And this becomes relevant to a whole range of activities as a diplomat. So it's our public messaging, it's our private messaging with the particular government, with regional partners, with the donor community, with others who are focused on a particular society. It's incredibly useful to have these kinds of data. It also works for our programming, our use of foreign assistance. So my office deploys a small programming budget around transitional justice. Our Human Rights Bureau does. Even our International kind of Rule of Law Bureau, the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, they have a fund that can be put towards transitional justice in different societies. And so as a sort of point person of this work in government, it's really helpful to see what needs to be done within a society and where a little bit of investment in civil society or in government entities can help to maintain momentum towards building and implementing a genuine, inclusive, trauma-informed transitional justice process. And so I can use the money that I have to try and respond to some of the needs that you're able to identify in your survey work and your sort of thick description work within particular communities. So that's another area where it's incredibly important. And we do this unilaterally as the United States government, but we also really try and work with the larger donor community, with the local diplomatic community in particular societies. So we've created a platform for embassies that are engaged in Ethiopia to meet on a regular basis around transitional justice. And we have used and featured the data that came out of Tadesse and others' work in order to inform the local community, diplomatic community, as to what is being done, what people want to see, and then also help us shape and coordinate our own messaging with the government, our own foreign assistance, et cetera. So we're not working at cross purposes or over-investing in some areas and under-investing in others. So it's really a helpful way to kind of bring everybody together. In terms of the two communities that you identified, and obviously extremely timely that you focused on both Ethiopia and Ukraine. I mean, Ethiopia, as Tadesse described, is at an interesting point. They've initiated a large national dialogue process that really addresses questions of what does it mean to be Ethiopia and to be an Ethiopian in a federated state, in a multi-ethnic community, a community that has been racked by violence, but violence that manifests itself very differently within the different sub-political units around the country. And that's why the disaggregation of data by, what do people in Tigray think versus Somali versus Afar versus Oromia is incredibly important, because violence manifested itself very differently in those communities in terms of state actors, non-state actors, paramilitaries, et cetera. They're very committed at the political level, at least at a certain level, to investing in real transitional justice. And they've had this iterative process of the green paper, and now we have a white paper that's a policy plan. And there's really very committed, strong individuals who are bringing in outside experts in order to inform this process. We also know, however, that there may be a political ceiling here, because part of that process, and the survey data reveal this, has to include government responsibility, because the government is seen as part of the problem. They were the originators of some of that violence, not all. There were non-state actors, there were sub-state actors, Eritrea was involved, etc. But we cannot countenance a process that focuses only on those non-state or non-Ethiopian actors without really tackling the challenge of governmental violence and the role that the government played in fomenting and carrying out violence within the different communities. So that's where that political ceiling comes in, and that's where the diplomatic community can step in and really urge the government to continue to invest in a process. Ukraine is at a very different place in its sort of trajectory of this terrible war of aggression by Russia, and the work at Georgetown, and I see that Anna's on the call, has been really important in this regard, because the collaborator question is going to be a vexing one. Already there are criminal cases against individuals who are perceived to be collaborators, and they get counted in the larger data on the number of kind of wartime cases that are being brought. There's also POW cases, and they're in absentia cases, but these collaborator cases are really tough. And when you speak with Ukrainians, they're not ready to tackle that question yet. They're not ready to think about transitional justice in a post-war context. They're still in a hot conflict. And so there's still that sense of needing to and wanting to create some sort of a criminal justice response to individuals who, across the spectrum, were true collaborators in the sense that they were sort of being spotters and helping the Russians to implement the war of aggression and the occupation of those regions, to the other end of the spectrum, where there's someone who's willing to teach in Russian because that's what's being expected of them. Are they a collaborator in the same sense that the spotter is, or someone who's working in a detention center in an occupied area is? I think all of us would say no, but like where that line is something that the Ukrainians will need to grapple with. They're not quite ready to do so yet. So we're just starting as a policymaker and as working with our Ukrainian colleagues to just kind of seed that conversation with them so that they're ready when the time comes. And so this sort of survey data is incredibly important, but it's also going to be important, as you all know, to do this over time, because attitudes do change. Reconciliation may become more appealing at a later point than it is now while we're still in the midst of a hot conflict. And I'll just close with the kind of another vexing problem, which is like how to manage expectations here. Because when you do survey work, there is, I think, in people's minds, the impression that their answers will go to the government, and the government will be responsive to those answers and will try and implement their expectations and preferences. And we know that there's often a disjuncture there. And we know that some things will be not politically possible. So as Tadesse noted, many of those surveys requested and preferred an international response. Why? Well, it increases credibility. They may have skepticism about their own national systems. They want the international community to be involved because they see what happened to them as something of international concern. Ukrainians feel very strongly about this as well when it comes to the aggression tribunal. They don't feel like they should be going at this alone, but it should have that international imprimatur. And if there's a lack of faith in institutions, having international expertise can be incredibly helpful from a capacity building perspective, but also to provide a measure of sort of oversight to make sure that international standards are being respected in any sort of a transitional justice response. Now, that means the government has to be willing to allow the international community some kind of inroads into their process. And this is where the sort of privilege of sovereignty can also often kick in, where governments don't want there to be international involvement. They want to handle it themselves. And we know there are many ways to hybridize a transitional justice process. You can have a true hybrid institution that has international judges sitting side by side with their national counterparts, and international sprinkled all throughout a whole org chart, as Tadesse showed us. Or you can have a much more modest enterprise where you have some international expertise, some international funding, but really working in an advisory capacity and not playing a central role in a set of institutions. And so different communities will count, and different governments will countenance different degrees of hybridization, different degrees of international involvement. And that, again, is a place where I think the international community, the donor community, the diplomatic community can be helpful in encouraging governments to allow and to be willing to open their systems up to some measure of international involvement, because it brings them ultimately some legitimacy, it brings them capacity building, it brings them comparative expertise, it brings them attention to their process. So there's many goods that will flow from allowing for a process to be internationalized. And so sometimes overcoming the natural skepticism and reticence of a government can be extremely challenging. So we need to manage expectations with survivors so that they don't think that they're going to get everything that they've asked for or that they've told that they want in a particular survey instrument. And so just managing those relationships and keeping an open dialogue. And this is something where I think governments do not do a great job of communicating with their societies. I've seen this across the board in a number of transitional states where there's good things happening within governmental committees and expert bodies and parliaments, but they're not conveying that to the people. And so the people think nothing is happening. And so they lose faith in the process. So an investment in that kind of outreach is incredibly important. And I think civil society actors and academic partners like this consortium can really play an important role there as well. So with that, I will close with my thanks and gratitude for incredible research. It's been really a privilege to be a part of this conversation over the last years, and it's been fascinating to see your results. And I just encourage you to keep going, and please reach out if there's any way that we can be helpful, but know that we are consuming your work avidly, and it is playing out in our policy decisions and our programming, et cetera. So thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Ambassador. And it's been a pleasure interacting with you and your team. And thank you for opening the space, especially giving life to some of the work that we're working on.